Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today, the top 10 famous people allegedly killed by the Illuminati. From the Bilderberg Group to the Illuminati, many people believe that the richest of society control the world and have the power to decide who lives and who dies. It's certainly not out of the question. 8 of the richest men in the world have more wealth than half of the world's population combined. So why would it be surprising if they came together to promote their own interests? And what would they do if their interests became threatened? The answer is as clear as a cloudless sky. The people who threaten their power might end up dead. In the video today, we look at 10 famous deaths that might have been murders ordered by the Illuminati. Number 10. Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was more than just a black leader. He was more than just a civil rights leader or a champion of the poor. Dr. King was a threat to the most powerful men in the wealthiest country in the world. The fear that they had of him was demonstrated in the fact that he was under constant surveillance by the FBI. A letter was even sent to King's address suggesting that he commit suicide rather than have his sins be shared with the public. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover even went so far as to say Dr. Martin Luther King is the most notorious liar in the country. Near the end of his life, Dr. King had begun to discuss and champion issues that transcended race, issues of class conflict, and the importance of solidarity amongst workers. Dr. King would arrive in Memphis to lend support to the Memphis sanitation workers' strike, and not long after, a man would take his life. Many people know the name of King's convicted killer, James Earl Ray, but few realize that a separate wrongful death lawsuit was filed and that a jury concluded that there was a conspiracy to murder Dr. King. Lloyd Jowers, the owner of a restaurant near the motel where King was assassinated, put forward evidence detailing the conspiracy, alleging that James Earl Ray was just a scapegoat. Even King's family does believe that Ray was innocent. The claims he made, as well as other evidence presented by the King family, led to the wrongful death conviction. However, despite the ruling of the jury, the Department of Justice rejected the ruling of the jury, citing the lack of evidence. Number 9. John F. Kennedy. The assassination of John F. Kennedy and the reasons for it has probably become one of the most debated in modern political history. A transformative figure who became the youngest man ever elected president, Kennedy was sworn into office during a tumultuous period in American history. Abroad, Kennedy had to ease rising tensions with the Soviet Union, while at home the demands of equal rights by African Americans was not going away. These same ideas of freedom and equality were being espoused by the formerly colonialized people of Vietnam and their leader Ho Chi Minh, who aligned himself with the Soviet Union. President Kennedy had to make a decision. He could follow the advice of his generals and impede Vietnam's ability to choose a socialist-style government, or choose a path of non-intervention. Years earlier, President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex, stating,
"We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex."
So did Kennedy hesitate to fully commit to a war in Vietnam? And is that what led to his death? That's what many have indeed suggested, but the truth is that President Kennedy had ordered military advisors to be sent to Vietnam, and there's little evidence that he recommended or suggested an end to the involvement in the region. However, is it possible that a general or a businessman wanted a guarantee of war? Well, the answer to that is absolutely. The murder of Lee Harvey Oswald, Kennedy's assassin, has also raised additional questions as to the motives behind the assassination. Murdered by Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner who had connections to the mob, it's been suggested that Kennedy's death was a response by organized crime for his administration's crackdown on their activities. Number 8. Sam Cooke. A musical icon known for recording hits like Twisting the Night Away, Wonderful World, Chain Gang, and the legendary A Change Is Gonna Come, Sam Cooke was an artist who threatened to change the music industry. A man who had managed to compile a string of 29 consecutive top 40 hits between the years of 1957 and 1964, this put Cooke in a very unique position. He was an absolute cash cow. And, well, he knew it, and record executives knew it too. As a result of his success, Cooke was able to negotiate ownership of his master recordings, which was an industry rarity. And although he was such a commercially successful artist, Cooke was still an active participant and voice in the civil rights movement. A Change Is Gonna Come became the song of the civil rights movement, and Cooke would put his money where his mouth was, demonstrated by his arrest for disturbing the peace for attempting to check into a whites-only hotel. Cooke, he represented a threat to the status quo, and one night in a dingy motel, he was shot and killed. The details of his death remain murky, but what has been reported is that Cooke, in a rage, charged at the motel clerk, prompting her to shoot him. Allegedly, Cooke had forced himself onto his female companion, who had run away in fear. Upon returning to the motel, the clerk felt compelled to fire. However, his funeral, it would suggest otherwise. After attending Cooke's funeral, Etta James claimed the singer's body was ravaged in a manner inconsistent with the short scuffle reported. In her biography, she would go on to say that Cooke looked badly beaten, and his head was almost separated from his right shoulder. Further, his face was smashed in, and his hands were totally crushed. It must be said here that the clerk who Cooke engaged in with this struggle, who separated his shoulder and crushed his hands, was a small 55-year-old woman. Number 7. Marilyn Monroe. Many know Marilyn Monroe as simply a sex symbol, but she was much more than that. Monroe was a rebel who did not flinch when it came to associating herself with those who seemed undesirable. When the McCarthy hearings were in full swing, she was warned against associating with Arthur Miller, a well-known playwright, but she did so anyway. Her testimony resulted in Miller being spared from jail. In addition, when legendary black singer Etta James was kept from performing at a prominent jazz club, Monroe asked for her friend to be hired and promised to sit in the front row every night she was there. The owner relented and James was allowed to perform. James credits Monroe with greatly aiding her career and allowing her to play at bigger venues from then on. It was this same rebelliousness that may have gotten Monroe in trouble, though. As a result of her movie stardom and her great beauty, Monroe came into contact and formed relationships with people of the highest order in the United States, and this included the Kennedys. There are several theories outlining the reasons for Monroe's death, supposing that her demise was not a genuine suicide. In Victim, The Secret Tapes of Marilyn Monroe by Matthew Smith, he argued that the CIA knew Monroe and Robert Kennedy were having an affair, and he killed her as a reprisal for the Kennedy family's disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. Another theory outlined in the book, Double Cross, was that Monroe was actually murdered on the orders of Chicago mafia boss Sam Giancana. The authors argue that she was killed in order to send a message to Robert Kennedy so that he would back off his crusade against the mob. Number 6. John Lennon. The singer, songwriter, and arguably the most influential Beatle, died like all of our cases in this video, under suspicious circumstances. The Beatles catapulted onto the American scene, eventually becoming the best-selling band in history. However, much like Sam Cooke, their commercial success didn't exclude them from social activism, as the Beatles became a symbol of the counterculture of the 1960s. The most radical of the group was undoubtedly John Lennon, and one only has to go as far as his song Imagine to see this. In his song, he proposes a world without hunger and war, and it's easy to see how this rhetoric can pose a threat to the establishment. In December 1980, 25-year-old Mark David Chapman shot down Lennon as he exited his limousine. Prosecutors have claimed that Chapman was a loner and angry with the fact that his hero had proved to be phony. The theory was widely accepted, despite the fact that it worked to not only cast aspirations on Lennon's authenticity, but also served to undermine his message. A recent report, however, has come to argue that Lennon was actually killed by the CIA. In a newly published work, Phil Strongman argues that Chapman was a stooge made to take the blame. One of his major points attempts to undermine the idea that Chapman was indeed a fan of Lennon. Strongman says, Chapman, the supposed Lennon obsessive and fan of fans, did not own one Lennon single, book, or album. Another example made to label Chapman as a stalker was the claim that he had 4 hours of tapes of Lennon's songs in his rucksack on the day of the shooting. They have never been photographed or produced for the simple reason that they do not exist. Number 5. Michael Jackson. The King of Pop needs no introduction. However, a recent interview by his daughter, Paris Jackson, reveals that his death was no accident, at least allegedly. According to his daughter, Michael Jackson was murdered, and she plans on seeking justice. Asked who would want to see her father murdered, Paris replied that her father had a lot of enemies. In the months leading up to his death, Paris remembers her father fearing for his life, with Michael even saying, "They're going to kill me one day." Before dying, Jackson owed nearly $500 million to creditors. However, this does not mean that the singer was not a shrewd businessman, as many of his debts were the result of borrowing against highly valued assets. One of the shrewdest that he made was purchasing a 50% stake in the Sony ATV publishing catalog. He bought the entity's precursor, ATV, for $47.5 million in 1985, knowing the value of the rights to the songs contained in it by the Beatles. 10 years later, he was paid $100 million for merging his catalog with Sony, and currently the Sony ATV catalog itself is worth nearly $2 billion. This is because of its ownership of copyrights to songs by the Beatles, Bob Dylan, Taylor Swift, Lady Gaga, as well as many others. Number 4. Abraham Lincoln. The most well-documented conspiracy in this video is the assassination of Abraham Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth. A fierce Southerner loyal to the Confederacy, Booth murdered Lincoln as part of a larger plan to reinvigorate the defeated South. Not only was Lincoln meant to die, but his vice president and Secretary of State were as well. George Esderod was tasked with killing Vice President Andrew Johnson, but lost his nerve and was eventually hanged for his participation. Another member of the conspiracy was Lewis Powell, who attempted and failed to kill the Secretary of State, William Seward, injuring the secretary, his son, and his bodyguard before being disarmed. He too was later executed for treason. Number 3. Jimi Hendrix. Another case of a star meeting his demise far too soon was the overdose of Jimi Hendrix. The rock and roll legend died at the age of 27, but still managed to become arguably the most accomplished guitarist in history. Hendrix had a troubled childhood, constantly fearing his family would split apart and having to overcome poverty and abuse. Nonetheless, Hendrix pursued his love of music, beginning as a child when he carried around a broomstick which he pretended to play like a guitar. While his love of guitar and music still burned as strongly as an adult as it did as a child, the mechanisms in which he coped with his childhood traumas threatened to destroy him. Hendrix frequently used drugs, and on September 18, 1970, his girlfriend discovered him unconscious. He was rushed to the hospital and soon after pronounced dead. The official cause of death was asphyxia while intoxicated with barbiturates. But this is something that is now being called into question. John Bannister, the doctor who attempted to revive Hendrix at the hospital, has supported claims, at least in confirming they are plausible, that Hendrix was actually murdered. Allegedly, Hendrix's manager, Michael Jeffrey, believed the guitar player was worth more to him dead than alive. This claim was put forward by a former Hendrix roadie named Tappy Wright, who believes Hendrix was murdered. His frequent drug and alcohol use made Hendrix unreliable and thus less valuable. Jeffrey placed a $2 million life insurance policy on his client and hired men to carry out the task. This is, of course, only according to Wright. Number 2. Princess Diana. Like Michael Jackson, Princess Diana feared the worst. She believed, and quite possibly knew, that she was going to be killed. In a letter to Paul Burrell, Diana's butler, the princess shared her fear of death. The letter is remarkable as Diana somehow came to predict the exact manner in which she would meet her demise. She wrote the letter following the death of her bodyguard, which she believed to be part of the conspiracy. Lastly, the letter suggested the existence of conflict or drama within the royal family. Known as the Royal Rebel, was Diana killed because she upset the established order? Well, it certainly does seem possible. Number 1. Robert F. Kennedy. For those who do not know the full story of Robert Kennedy's assassination, well, I hope you're sitting down. It seemed at the time to be an open and shut case, as the killer, Sirhan Sirhan, was arrested with a literal smoking gun. Sirhan later stated his obsession for killing Kennedy was a result of RFK's support of Israel. Sirhan, a Palestinian refugee, allegedly wanted to kill Kennedy on behalf of all the exploited people of his country and the region as a whole. The story, though, it soon became more complicated. When Sirhan was apprehended, he was facing Kennedy directly. However, the bullets that killed Kennedy hit him from behind. Guests remember Sirhan only being able to fire 2 shots at Kennedy before being tackled, eventually getting off a total of 8 shots. In the hotel room where Kennedy was shot, investigators found a total of 14 shots lodged in the room, as well as in other victims. This simply does not add up. How could a gun only containing 8 shots be used to fire a total of 14? For those who are skeptical, an audio recording was made available from the shooting, and it too seems to confirm that there were more than 8 shots fired. So this leaves us with the question, well, who killed Robert F. Kennedy? 3 men were pictured and seen the night Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and were confirmed by colleagues to be members of the CIA. Like his brother, Robert Kennedy may have shared the same fate. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, hit that thumbs up button below and do not forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also over there on the right, some other videos from the archives which are well worth checking out. And as always, thank you for watching.